Hi everyone and welcome. Today I'm going to talk about CRP or C-reactive protein, and the reason I'm doing that is because I've been talking a lot about insulin and insulin resistance, and some people are always asking me about CRP and how that is relating to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, etc. And if we can use that as a marker for insulin resistance or just as an inflammatory marker. So CRP is generally an inflammatory marker that we are using when we do blood tests. So this is a normal test that they usually do. It's a standard test, it's nothing specific, and if you are hospitalized, you will most certainly have this test taken. So C-reactive protein is just as I said, another inflammatory marker that your liver will produce in response to other inflammatory compounds in your blood, such as interleukin 6, for example, is a good one, TNF alpha, those sort of things. So when you have inflammation, your CRP will go up, and that is because your liver reacts to those inflammatory markers. So it's just one thing that you can use to measure inflammation, literally, or to confirm, I would say, because we don't generally measure interleukin 6 or TNF alpha in the blood, so it's easy to just measure your CRP. And CRP or your liver responds very quickly producing CRP. So if you have an acute inflammation, so you cut your arm off or whatever, or even just you cut yourself a little bit, it won't take more than 6 hours until your CRP levels are elevated. So it's a fairly quick response. And remember that I said acute inflammation, because this is key. So if you remove the other inflammatory markers, CRP will also go down. So it's just responding to what's actually going on. It just shows you what's going on. And its half-life is about 19 hours. So after 19 hours, you will have half the level of what you had 19 hours ago. That's how you measure half-life. So if the other general inflammatory markers are going down, you're getting less IL-6, you are getting less TNF alpha, etc., then your CRP will also go down. So when you have a lot of those inflammatory markers, your CRP will go up. When you have less of them, it will go down. And that's pretty predictable. Naturally, CRP is increased by any sort of, infection or inflammation or, trauma, that sort of thing. It just happens because that is what will trigger the inflammatory response. But it's not naturally elevated when you have a viral infection, because or in certain autoimmune diseases either. When you have viral infections, usually what is happening is that virus reproduces inside of your cells, it's hiding, so it won't attract all these inflammatory markers that bacteria do. So that can be a little bit sneaky. So I'm going to show you some numbers that that the hospitals are looking at when they are doing these tests. So here you go. So these are the kind of cutoff values that the hospitals are using. So they might, if you're hospitalized, and they might monitor you for a bacterial disease that you're having, they will see what is happening with your CRP over time, whether your immune system is actually managing to fighting this bacteria off or not. So anything between 10 to 40 milligrams per liter is classified as mild inflammation. Acute inflammation and bacterial infections are usually between 40 and 200 milligrams per liter, and if you have severe trauma or sepsis, it's over 300 milligrams per liter, and that's usually a warning sign that something's completely wrong here and they have to take action. So this is how CRP is used and measured, but most of us aren't really interested in any acute inflammation. We're more interested in chronic low-grade inflammation, because that's what is causing a lot of the health problems that we're usually dealing with. Mind you, the hospitals are sometimes interested in this as well, but specifically with measuring your risk of coronary artery disease. Let me get rid of that. Here you go. So if you find a lab that is performing something that they call high sensitivity CRP, what they mean is, and what they're measuring is low grade chronic inflammation. Okay, so this is a different test because the normal test that the hospitals are doing is measuring 10 to 40, etc. is not that sensitive that it won't pick up on low grade inflammation and low CRP levels. So you need to make sure that if you want to check the low chronic ongoing inflammation that you're having that might be causing a lot of your health problems, you want to go for a high sensitive CRP test. And usually they're measuring in the range from 0.5 to 0.1, sorry, it's 0.1 up to 5, something like that, milligrams per liter as well. And a CRP between 1 and 3 is considered a moderate risk for cardiovascular disease, and anything above 3 means a high risk for cardiovascular disease. So if you're scared of that, maybe that is a good test for you to do. Then we have some other factors. I'm going to show you on the screen here. We have some other factors that also affect our CRP levels. So that would be things like smoking. If you are having a fag, you go in for a lab test 20 minutes later, you're having some sort of acute inflammation because you have just been smoking, and that is very inflammatory in your lungs, and you will have pretty much you will have increased CRP levels because you're smoking. And as I said, it takes 6 hours for your liver to produce as much CRP as it will do in response to the inflammatory markers floating around in your body. So unless you're a smoker that will, abstain from smoking for a couple of days at least, you're going to have elevated CRP due to that smoking, but you're also going to have elevated inflammation because of the smoking. And then you have things like adiposity, blood pressure, triglycerides, and HDL, and exercise can increase your CRP. All of these things are things that will increase your inflammation either temporarily or ongoingly. And then I've included 2 more here. So this is serum lipoproteins and monoclonal antibodies, especially IgM lambda. And I included them because when these can actually be, they can trick the equipment and they can give you a false increase in CRP. So if you come out with a elevated CRP level and you actually have high serum lipoproteins or IgM lambda and monoclonal antibodies, it might not be your CRP that is actually elevated, but you won't know. So there are some problems with this test. It's not bulletproof. Now, since I have been talking a lot about insulin and blood glucose lately, and a couple of you have been asking about the whether there is a correlation between CRP and insulin resistance, and maybe where does HOMA-IR come into this, etc. I know we asked Nick when he was on, and he said that he did not see a correlation, but I thought I would have a look at a few studies, and I find there are lots and lots of studies. So I'm just going to read this to you quickly. So I found a Japanese cohort which definitely established a relationship between HOMA-IR and CRP and body weight, but not HOMA-IR beta, which is the when you're measuring C-peptide and the function of your beta cells. So I'm talking about the fasting insulin, the test that I had done. They could definitely establish a relationship between these. So they can see elevated CRP levels when your HOMA-IR is high or your insulin is high. Then I found another one in Peruvian adults. They had 3 categories. So they had CRP less than 0.81 milligrams per deciliter. between 0.81 and 2.53 and over 2.53, and they found that the CRP was significantly associated with increased fasting insulin and HOMA-IR levels in people, and women with a CRP over 2.53 had a 2.18-fold increased risk of insulin resistance as compared to those in the lowest group, and the men had a 2.54 increased risk. So they have seen a correlation there as well. Then a third study concluded that healthy non-diabetic women, if their CRP is independently associated with fasting hyperinsulinemia. And just for your information, they concluded that physical activity, alcohol consumption, and hormone replacement therapy were also related to fasting insulin and can therefore affect the CRP levels indirectly. And a fourth one said that CRP levels are higher in people with central obesity than those without, and also in those with higher plasma glucose levels. So there you go. Everything is kind of related. So what I think we can conclude is that CRP levels can absolutely be are absolutely correlated with the insulin resistance and your risk of getting insulin resistance, or maybe just in the elevated insulin levels, etc. But there's a huge problem here. There is no specific measurement because we're all different, and CRP, in my opinion anyway, is not... If you go to one lab and measure it and then you go to another lab, you're not going to get, the same value. You're never going to do that with any tests, to be fair. But in my opinion, they don't really tell you it doesn't really tell you anything. It's and as a measure of insulin resistance is pretty useless, dare I say. It's like using BMI and adiposity to predict type 2 diabetes risk. We know that when you are overweight, when you have a lot of central accumulation of fat, you're more likely to get diabetes. But could it maybe be the other way? It's the insulin resistance that is causing that. So we know that there's a correlation, but it's not true for everyone. So as a group, it might be a useful tool to just say that that's what could happen. But for a specific individual, I don't think that's very useful. So you could obviously tell that a person is overweight and then that might be at an increased risk for developing type 2 diabetes, but it doesn't mean that they will. And so if you're going for a blood test, I think you're much better off just measuring insulin, because that's what you actually want to know. And it will tell you a lot more and actually be a more direct measure of whether you are on your way to diabetes or not. And I have a dog chasing flies in the background, if you're wondering what that noise is. So what do you do if you have high CRP? I mean, you might have an infection that you don't know about. You might have a cold, but your immune system is taking care of it, so you don't notice. It could be things like that. CRP only tells you that you have some sort of inflammatory event going on in your body, but it can't really tell you what is going on. Which is why it's just one of many inflammatory markers the labs are looking for, and in my opinion it should be used as that as well. So if it's in the range of mild or acute inflammation, you might have caught some sort of bug and you just need to recover, and it's no big drama. If your value is between 1 and 10, you might be having a degree of chronic low-grade inflammation, and you might do even if you're having a higher value. It's really hard for me to tell. So the advice that I would give to you is no different than any other if your CRP level is elevated. I will give it to anyone who's struggling with inflammation. Get rid of the crap food. That's the first thing you do. Get rid of the bad habits in your life. Like, go to bed Nessie, can we stop barking? Go to bed at a decent time. Make sure that you're getting enough sleep, because if you're not getting enough sleep, you won't be able to recover. It's when we're sleeping that our immune system is developing and that we're recovering from everything that is going on. So if you don't get sleep, you are probably going to have increased CRP levels. And if you're eating a lot of inflammatory foods, you're probably going to have a lot of inflammation. So just be aware of that. And also make sure that you get some sunlight. Actually, there are studies that saying that vitamin D and sun exposure will decrease your CRP levels. And one thing that we often forget about, we want to add a lot of things that are good for us, but what's most important is to get rid of the things that are bad for you. If you can get rid of those offenders that are causing the inflammation in the first place, you're so much better off than adding something that will reduce the inflammation. Because then it's like trying to extinguish a fire that you keep putting gasoline on. Rather, remove the gasoline and the fire will go down on its own, and that is so much easier to deal with than trying to combat it with anti-inflammatory pills, etc. It's not usually the best way of doing things. Those kind of interventions might be necessary and might be good as a short-term help, but they shouldn't be a way of existing and making things work over time. So that was all I had for you today, and I hope you have found that a little bit useful anyway, and maybe I hope that I've answered a few questions. If you're not subscribed to the channel yet, just hit that subscribe button, hit the bell if you want to know when I'm coming online or uploading new videos. Give it a thumbs up and share with everyone you know, and I will see you again very soon. Take care, bye!